There is a particular kind of evil that does not announce itself with a roar. It does not arrive wearing a villain's face or carrying a weapon in plain sight. It arrives quietly, dressed in a hard hat and a clipboard, with a signature on a piece of paper and a smirk hiding just behind professional courtesy. It arrives on an ordinary Tuesday morning, when the sky is pale gray and the birds are still half asleep and 31 men are pulling on their boots, kissing their wives, and walking toward a hole in the earth that they trust will give them back at the end of the day. That trust was the most expensive thing those men ever owned. And, on that Tuesday, it was taken from them without a single word of warning. This is not a story invented for entertainment. The names have been changed to protect the families who still carry this weight in their chests every time it rains, every time a door closes too loudly, every time the earth makes a sound they can't immediately explain. But, the events, the decisions made, the doors sealed, the smirks worn on the faces of men who believed they would never be held to account, those are real. They happened. And, the silence that followed was the loudest thing anyone in that valley had ever heard. The Darwa coal mine sat at the base of a mountain range in a region where the earth was so rich with carbon it seemed to breathe black. The mountain had been dug into for nearly 4 decades. First by a government operation that ran it with modest safety, then by a private company that bought the license in the mid-90s and immediately began treating the mountain the way a man treats a fruit he intends to eat all at once rather than harvest over a season. By the time Rajan Mehta took over as the mine's operational director in 2009, the Darwa mine had already survived 2 small roof collapses, 1 gas leak that sent 7 men to the hospital, and an inspection report that described the ventilation system as functionally inadequate. That report had been filed and, then, quietly reassigned to a cabinet in an office where files went to age without ever becoming action. Rajan was 44 years old. He had an engineering degree from a mid-tier college, a mortgage on a house that was larger than he needed, a car that cost more than it should, and a very specific understanding of what his job required him to do. His job, as the company's chairman had explained it to him during a 40-minute lunch at a restaurant where the bread alone cost what a miner earned in half a day, was to increase output by 30% within 18 months. Not to increase safety. Not to address the ventilation report. Not to slow the drilling on the eastern wall, where a geological survey from 2006 had identified a fault line that ran like a hidden scar through the mountain's interior. 30% more coal. That was the mission. And Rajan, who was practical above all things, accepted the mission because the alternative was to be replaced by someone who would accept it faster and complain less. The miners at Darwa were not naive men. They were men who had grown up in the valley, whose fathers had worked the same mountain, who had learned early that coal dust got into everything: your lungs, your fingernails, your marriage, your children's futures. They knew the mine was not a safe place. No mine is a safe place. But there is a spectrum between dangerous and criminally reckless, and most of them sensed, somewhere in the knot of their stomachs, that Darwa had been drifting toward the wrong end of that spectrum for years. Suresh Babu was one of the older miners, 52 years old, with wide flat hands that had pulled coal from the earth for 30 years. He had a habit of patting the tunnel walls as he walked past them, the way you might pat the shoulder of an old friend, reading something in the stone that others couldn't feel. He had been doing it more often lately. His palm would press against the wall and hold there for a moment longer than necessary, and then he would pull it away and say nothing, and the younger men would watch him and wonder what he was listening for. His son-in-law, Deepak, 26 years old and 8 months into his first year at the mine, had asked him about it once. They were sitting in the changing room before a morning shift, lacing up their boots in the particular focused silence that men develop when they are preparing themselves mentally for confined darkness. "Why do you always touch the wall like that?" Deepak had asked. Suresh had not looked up from his boot. "Because the wall talks," he said. "And, if you're stupid enough not to listen, it'll say its piece whether you're ready or not." Deepak had laughed. He was young enough to think that was an old man being philosophical. He was not yet old enough to know that old miners are not being philosophical when they talk about what the earth says. They are being literal. On the morning of March 14, 31 men signed into the Darwa mine at 6:40 in the morning. The shift supervisor was a man named Hakim, 38, who had been at the mine for 11 years and who kept a logbook in his chest pocket that he wrote in with the focused seriousness of someone who understood that paper trails were the only things that survived when everything else was gone. He noted the time. He noted the crew. He noted, as he did every morning, that the ventilation gauge at Station 3 had been reading lower than the required threshold for the past 11 days and that he had submitted a written complaint about this to the management office on March 4 and had received no response. He noted it because he did not know what else to do with the knowledge. He could not fix the ventilation system himself. He could not refuse to send the men in. If he refused, they would simply be sent in without him and he would lose his job, and then, who would keep the logbook? So he wrote it down. He noted the discrepancy. He sent the complaints. He kept the records. He told himself that this was the responsible thing to do, and, in the hollow space between his ribs where the truth lived, he knew that it was not enough, but he did not know how to make himself enough. At 7:15, the 31 men reached their assigned sections. The eastern tunnel, where Suresh and Deepak and 14 others were working, extended nearly 400 meters into the mountain. The smell there was different from the entrance tunnels, denser, more ancient, like the mountain was exhaling something it had been holding for centuries. The light strung along the ceiling cast everything in that particular yellow that makes men look like figures in an old painting, flattened and, somehow distant from themselves. At 7:40, the first sound happened. It was not a dramatic sound. It was not the roar of a collapse or the shriek of metal under pressure. It was a sound that Suresh described later, much later, in circumstances no one would have predicted that morning, as being similar to the sound a house makes in the deepest part of winter, when the temperature drops fast and the wood contracts. A tick. A settling. Something, somewhere, adjusting. He stopped working. He pressed his hand to the wall. At the surface, in the management building that sat above the mine like a crown on an anxious head, 3 men were having a meeting that had nothing to do with the tick in the eastern tunnel. Rajan Mehta was there. Beside him was Vijay Sood, the company's regional compliance officer, a man who had spent 15 years becoming very good at making problems disappear from documents without actually making them disappear from reality. The third man was Prakash Lal, a government mines inspector whose visits to Darwa had, over the preceding 4 years, been gradually converted from oversight into theater. He arrived, he was given tea, he was shown the sections of the mine that were presentable, and he left with a form signed and a small envelope that found its way into his jacket pocket before he reached his car. The 3 of them were sitting with a set of documents spread across a table. The documents were the results of a structural assessment that had been commissioned privately, not officially, not on record, by the company 3 weeks earlier. The assessment had been conducted by an independent engineer named Sharma who had walked the eastern tunnel and come back looking pale. His report was on the table. Rajan had read it twice. The language was technical but the meaning was unavoidable. The eastern wall had developed new fracturing along the fault line identified in 2006. The fault had been deepened by the accelerated drilling schedule. The tunnel's structural integrity in sectors E7 through E11 was, in Sharma's measured professional language, not suitable for continued active extraction without immediate reinforcement. In plain language, which Sharma had also been careful to include because he was not a man who trusted that professional language was always enough, continuing to send men into sectors E7 through E11 without reinforcing the walls and sealing first was likely to kill them. The report had arrived on Rajan's desk on March 9. The miners had continued working in sectors E7 through E11 on March 10th, 11th, 12th, and 13th. They were working there right now, at 7:40 on the morning of March 14th, when the mountain made its first small sound. Vijay Sood leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way a man looks at the ceiling when he is doing arithmetic in his head. Then, he looked at Prakash Lal. Then, he looked at Rajan. If we shut it down now, Vijay said, we're admitting we knew. No one at the table disagreed with this. The knowing was the problem. Not the fault line. Not the inadequate ventilation. Not the 15 days of ignored complaints. The knowing was what needed to be managed, and the knowing was sitting on that table in the form of Sharma's report, and the question on the table was what to do about the knowing. Rajan was quiet for a moment. In that moment, the story of what kind of man he was arrived at its final answer. He reached across the table and picked up Sharma's report. He did not tear it. He did not throw it away. He simply opened the drawer of the table and placed it inside, face down, and closed the drawer. "We continue the shift," he said. Vijay nodded, slowly, the way a man nods when he is filing the moments somewhere in his mind where he can find it later if he needs to. Prakash Lal said nothing. He picked up his tea and drank from it. Down in the eastern tunnel, at 8:03, the second sound happened. This one was longer. Not a tick. Something more like a breath, a low, vibrating groan that moved through the stone the way sound moves through water, passing through the bodies of the men who stood in it before they fully understood what it was. Suresh heard it and felt it at the same time. His hand was on the wall and the wall was talking, and, for the first time in 30 years, he was genuinely afraid of what it was saying. He turned around. He looked at Deepak, who was standing 10 meters behind him with his drill hanging at his side and an expression that was trying to be calm and not managing it. "We go," Suresh said. He did not say it loudly. He did not make it a question. He put his tool down against the wall with great care, as though setting something fragile on a shelf, and he began walking toward the exit. Deepak followed. Then Mohan, who was 29 and had a daughter who was 3 months old. Then Babu Singh, who was 41 and had been planning to retire in 4 years. Then the others, one by one, responding to something they felt in their blood before they understood it in their minds, the way animals move before a storm arrives. They had covered perhaps 40 meters when the mountain decided it had held itself together long enough. The sound this time was not subtle. It was the sound of something enormous choosing to stop pretending. A deep, sustained crack that began somewhere above them and traveled down and outward like a sentence being finished at last. The ceiling of Sector E9 dropped. Not all at once, it fell in stages, the way a tired thing falls, giving one last effort to hold and, then, surrendering. Rock and dust and the particular darkness that exists inside a mountain when all the lights go at once, and then the thick and complete silence that follows when the sound is done. When the dust began to settle, there were 12 men on the exit side of the collapse. There were 19 men on the other side. Suresh Babu was on the exit side, 5 meters from the fallen section, crouched against the tunnel wall with dust on his face and his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his teeth. He counted the men around him. He counted again. He called names into the dark. Some answered from beside him. Some did not answer from beside him. Deepak was not beside him. Deepak was on the other side. At the surface, the seismic monitoring equipment registered the collapse at 8:17. The alarm system, which was supposed to automatically alert the emergency response team when a seismic event of this magnitude occurred underground, had been operating with a software fault for the preceding 6 weeks. The fault had been reported. It had not been repaired. The alarm did not sound. At 8:24, a surface worker named Govind, who had been near the main shaft entrance, felt the ground shudder and saw a column of dust rise from the ventilation shaft that stood 50 meters from the entrance. He stood and stared at it for a moment. Then, he ran. He ran to the management building. He did not knock. He opened the door and he told the 3 men sitting around the table with the drawer containing the report exactly what he had seen. Rajan stood up. He walked to the window. He looked at the ventilation shaft, where the dust had now mostly cleared. He stood there for several seconds, looking at it, and the 2 men behind him waited for him to speak. When he turned around, his face had arranged itself into something that was not quite expression. "Get Hakim," he said. "Tell him to bring the main shaft crew up." Govind blinked. "What about the eastern crew?" Rajan looked at him. The look was not cruel, precisely. It was something worse than cruel, it was calculating. It was the face of a man who had already done the arithmetic and arrived at a number he found acceptable. "Get Hakim first," Rajan said. And that was the moment. That was the moment from which all the other moments flowed. Because getting Hakim first meant getting the main shaft crew up first, which meant accounting for the men who were easiest to account for, which meant the eastern crew, the 19 men now sitting in darkness on the wrong side of 100 tons of fallen rock, could wait while the surface arranged itself into something manageable. Govind did not know this yet. He was a simple man with a good heart and he thought he was being given instructions in an order that made logistical sense. He went to find Hakim. In the eastern tunnel, 12 men were moving through dust and fractured darkness toward the main shaft. They moved carefully, testing the floor, holding onto each other's arms in the black. Their headlamps had survived, most of them, and the beams cut through the thick air in pale columns that found nothing reassuring to land on. Suresh was moving with them, but he kept stopping and turning back to face the collapse. "Suresh, come," one of the men said. "We have to get out." "There are 19 men behind that," Suresh said. "We can't go through that. There's nothing we can do from here." "I know," Suresh said. And he turned and walked with them because he was a practical man and because he knew that doing something that killed him would not help Deepak. But he did not stop thinking about Deepak. He would not stop thinking about Deepak for a very long time. At 9:02, the 12 surviving members of the eastern crew reached the main shaft and began their ascent to the surface. They emerged into the pale morning light like men coming back from somewhere that had no proper name, covered in dust and breathing the open air with the desperate relief of people who have just understood, very physically, exactly how much they want to be alive. Suresh emerged last. He stood outside the shaft entrance and looked at the mountain. Then, he looked at the management building. Then, he looked at the small cluster of surface workers who had gathered, and at Hakim, who was standing with his logbook open and his pen in his hand and an expression that told Suresh everything he needed to know about what the man had already written down and what he feared would happen to what he had written down. He looked at all of this. Then, he said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "There are 19 men still inside." In the management building, Rajan Mehta was on the phone. He was not on the phone with the emergency services. He was on the phone with the company's legal counsel. And the conversation he was having was not about how to rescue the 19 men on the wrong side of the collapse. It was about how to manage what came next. Outside, a woman named Savitri, Deepak's mother, who had brought lunch to the mine gate every second Tuesday since her son started working there, was walking up the road toward the entrance. She had a tiffin container in her hand. She was early today. She could not have told you why she left home earlier than usual on that particular morning. She could only say that something had made her want to come. She saw the dust on the faces of the men standing outside the shaft. She saw the way they were standing, that particular stillness that men have when the thing they are not saying is too heavy to carry and too dangerous to put down. She saw Suresh Babu, whom she had known for years, standing at the edge of the group with the mountain's dust covering his face and his eyes doing something she had never seen eyes do before. She stopped walking. The tiffin container was still in her hand. And, somewhere inside that mountain, in the darkness behind 100 tons of fallen stone, 19 men were alive. They were sitting or crouching in the black, calling each other's names, checking each other for injuries, counting themselves, doing the arithmetic that none of them wanted to do. They had water. They had their lamps and a limited supply of battery power. They had the air that was currently in the tunnel with them, and the slow and unreliable trickle that came through the damaged ventilation system, the same system whose inadequacy had been reported 11 days ago and not repaired. They had each other. And they had no way of knowing that the 3 men in the building at the surface, the 3 men who had read the report and opened the drawer and closed the drawer and continued the shift, were at that moment not organizing a rescue. They were organizing a story. The 19 men in the dark did not know this yet. They were still in the part of the nightmare where rescue feels like a certainty, where you tell yourself that of course people are coming, of course the emergency systems have activated, of course the world on the other side of this rock is doing everything it can to reach you. They did not yet know that the world on the other side of this rock was doing something else entirely. Deepak was sitting against the tunnel wall with his knees pulled up and his headlamp pointed at the ceiling. He was 26 years old. He had been married for 2 years. His wife, Priya, was at home, probably making tea right now, probably thinking about what to cook for dinner, probably not yet afraid. He thought about her making tea in their small kitchen with the window that looked out over the neighbor's garden, and he held that image in his mind like a man holds a flame and wind carefully, with both hands, trying to keep it alive. He thought about Suresh. He had seen his father-in-law moving toward the exit when the sound started. He told himself Suresh had made it out. He was almost certain. He needed to be certain. He thought about the morning's second sound, the long groaning breath before the collapse, and the way Suresh had immediately and, without drama, set down his tool and said, "We go." He thought about how 30 years had taught the old man to hear what the mountain was saying, and he thought about all the mornings he had sat beside Suresh in the changing room and thought that the old man was being philosophical. He wasn't being philosophical. He was trying to teach Deepak to listen. And Deepak had listened this morning. He had followed. He had been close enough, had been moving fast enough, had been close enough to the exit side when the ceiling came down that fate or luck or whatever word you choose for the thing that decides these matters had put him on the wrong side of the collapse, but the right side of alive. He was alive. He was in the dark, in the mountain, with 18 other men, behind a wall of fallen rock, with air that was going to become a problem if no one fixed the ventilation, and, with a supply of water that he estimated, doing the math in his head because doing math was better than the alternative, would last approximately 4 to 5 days if they were careful. He was alive. At the surface, the 3 men in the management building had finished one phone call and were beginning another. The rescue coordinator's number was not the one being dialed. Outside, Savitri had set down her tiffin container on a stone wall and was standing very still, looking at the mountain, and the mountain was not giving anything back. And Rajan Mehta, standing at the window of the management building with the phone to his ear and the drawer containing Sharma's report somewhere behind him, looked out at the mountain and at the families who were beginning to arrive at the gate and at the dust that still hazed the air above the ventilation shaft. He straightened his collar. He smoothed his hair. And the expression that settled onto his face, the expression of a man who had decided on his version of events and intended to deliver it with conviction, was something between professional composure and what, if you looked at it with the correct understanding, was unmistakably a smirk. He had made a decision. He had placed the report in the drawer. He had continued the shift. He had run the arithmetic and he had found the number acceptable, and now it was time to speak to the families at the gate and to the press who would arrive soon and to the government officials who would come with their clipboards and their forms. He had done this before, in smaller ways. He understood how it worked. You controlled the information. You managed the timeline. You created just enough visible action rescue teams, press statements, sympathetic faces to demonstrate effort while ensuring that effort remained within acceptable bounds. The acceptable bounds, in this case, were the bounds that kept the drawer closed. He walked to the door. He opened it. He stepped out into the morning air. Below him, at the gate, a woman in a blue sari was standing with her hand pressed flat against the chain-link fence, looking through it at the mountain, and the expression on her face was the exact opposite of a smirk. It was open and raw and terrified, the face of someone who has not yet learned to hide what they feel because they have never before had a reason to. Her name was Savitri. Her son-in-law was behind that mountain. Rajan walked toward the gate. The story, as he intended to tell it, was about to begin. The truth, as it actually was sitting in a drawer in a building behind him, and it was patient, and it was not going anywhere. The families arrived the way families always arrive at disasters, not all at once, not in an organized wave, but in pieces, scattered by the uneven speed of bad news traveling through a community where some people had phones and some people heard things from neighbors and some people simply felt something wrong in the air and followed the feeling to the gate of the Darwa mine. By 10 in the morning, there were 40 or 50 people standing outside the chain-link fence. By noon, the number had grown past 100. By mid-afternoon, when the pale March sun had crossed its highest point and begun its slow descent, the crowd outside the Darwa mine gate was nearly 300 people strong: wives, mothers, fathers, brothers, children old enough to understand that their fathers had not come home at the right time, and younger children who did not understand any of it but who felt the tension in the arms of the adults holding them and responded to it the only way small children can. Savitri stood at the gate for 6 hours without sitting down. She was not the kind of woman who made scenes. She had grown up in a household where emotion was private and endurance was public, and so she did not shout or weep where others could see her. She simply stood. She had her hand on the fence and her eyes on the mountain, and she stood there with the particular stillness of a woman who has decided that moving would feel too much like giving up. She had spoken to Suresh, briefly, after the 12 men from the Eastern crew had emerged. He had found her at the gate and he had taken her hands and he had looked at her and she had understood from his face before he said a single word that Deepak was not with him and, also, crucially, that he was alive. Suresh believed he was alive. He had heard no collapse from the exit side of the fallen section as the 12 of them moved toward the surface, which meant the tunnel behind the fall was still standing, which meant the men behind it were still alive. "He's there," Suresh said. "He's behind the rock. He's alive." "How do you know?" she asked. "Because I would feel it if he wasn't," Suresh said. "The same way I felt the wall talking this morning. I would feel it." Savitri had looked at him for a long moment. Then, she had nodded and turned back to the fence and resumed standing. Rajan Mehta had addressed the families at 10:15 in the morning, standing at the gate with a microphone that someone had set up quickly and, with the manner of a man accustomed to speaking in front of people who were upset. His voice was controlled. His face was grave. He expressed deep concern. He described the incident as an unexpected geological event. He said that rescue teams were being assembled and that all available resources would be directed toward reaching the men in the eastern tunnel. He said that the company's primary concern was the safety and well-being of its workers and their families. He said all of this looking out at the crowd with the face of a man performing sincerity, and, from a certain distance, if you had not read Sharma's report and did not know about the drawer, it would have looked like sincerity. It had the right shape. The right pauses. The right heaviness around the eyes. Priya, Deepak's wife, was standing near the middle of the crowd. She had arrived 20 minutes earlier, called by a neighbor who had heard from someone else who had seen the dust column rising from the ventilation shaft. She was 24 years old and she was wearing the same clothes she had been wearing when she made tea that morning, a plain green salwar kameez that she had not thought to change because the thought of changing had not occurred to her in the space between receiving the news and running out of the house. She had her phone in her hand. She kept looking at it. Deepak had not called. He could not call. She knew he could not call. But she kept looking at the phone because looking at it was the only action available to her. She listened to Rajan speak. She watched his face. She was young and she did not have Suresh's 30 years of reading things that were trying not to be read, but she had something that functioned similarly. She had a person she loved absolutely, and the gap between the face of a man who was speaking the truth about her person and the face of a man who was performing the truth about her person was a gap she could feel in her body without being able to name it. Something was wrong with what he was saying. Not the words were the right words. But the words were wearing the face the way a costume wears a face, and, behind the costume, something was looking out at the crowd with a calculation that was not grief. She said nothing. She was 24 and standing at a mine gate and she had no power and no evidence and nothing but a feeling in her chest. She said nothing. At the mine itself, the rescue operation had been officially initiated. A team from the state's mine rescue brigade had arrived at 11:30. They were professionals, trained, experienced, equipped with the correct tools for assessing a collapse and beginning extraction. Their team leader, a man named Vikram Nair, 51 years old and 22 years in rescue work, walked the main shaft entrance and the damaged ventilation access points and made his preliminary assessment with the brisk efficiency of a man who has seen this shape of disaster before and who knows that the variables that determine whether the men inside live or die are mostly already fixed. The question now was which set of variables he was working with. He needed to know the exact location of the collapse, the condition of the tunnel behind it, the current state of the ventilation in the sealed section, the number of men and their last known positions, the structural stability of the rock fall itself, whether it was dense rubite or fractured debris that could be moved without triggering a secondary collapse. He asked for the mine's structural survey. He asked for the ventilation logs. He asked for the geological assessments. Hakim brought him the logbook. It was everything Hakim had: the day-to-day operational records, the complaint submissions, the shift manifests. Vikram read through it quickly and handed it back. "I need the structural survey," he said again. "And the ventilation infrastructure diagrams." Rajan's deputy, a young man named Anand who had been assigned to interface with the rescue team, said that he would get them and went away and came back 40 minutes later with a set of documents that were from 2014 and did not include the 2019 ventilation upgrade or Sharma's March 2024 assessment. Vikram looked at them. He looked at the date in the corner. "This is 10 years old," he said. Anand said that was the most recent survey available. Vikram looked at Anand for a moment with the very particular expression of a man who has been doing his job long enough to know when he is being managed. "Fine," he said. He said it the way a man says fine when he means the opposite of fine and intends to remember this conversation. He went back to his team. He recalibrated his approach. He would have to map the collapse manually, which meant more time. More time meant more pressure on the ventilation situation. More pressure on the ventilation situation meant the men inside were on a shorter clock than they needed to be. He made his revised plan and he began implementing it, and he said nothing to anyone in management about what he suspected, because he had learned 22 years had taught him this clearly, that saying things to management before you had the paper to back them up only gave management time to make the paper disappear. He was going to need the paper. Inside the mountain, the 19th hour had come and gone. The men in the sealed section had organized themselves with the practical competence of people who have no alternative to competence. The strongest and most experienced among them, a man named Balram who had been working in coal mines for 25 years and who had the calmness of someone whose relationship with underground spaces had long ago passed through fear into something more like familiarity, had taken the lead in the first half hour after the collapse, when shock was still settling through the group and decisions needed to be made before panic had the chance to fill the space that shock left behind. He counted the men. 19. He checked each of them for injuries. 2 had cuts from flying debris. Nothing broken. Nothing that couldn't be managed. He checked the water. They had 6 personal water bottles among them, various levels of fullness, plus a supply barrel near the section's equipment station that had perhaps 30 liters in it. He checked the food, 5 lunchboxes that the men had brought for their shift. He noted the ventilation, which was the most pressing concern. The airflow in the tunnel was weak, noticeably weaker than normal, and the air already carried more CO2 than was comfortable to breathe at length. He did the arithmetic the same way Deepak had done it, independently, arriving at similar conclusions. Water, 3 to 4 days with rationing. Air, the variable that worried him most. If the ventilation held at its current reduced level, they could survive several days. If it worsened, if the collapse had further damaged the already inadequate system, the timeline shortened considerably. He did not share the arithmetic in full with the other men. He shared enough. He told them they had sufficient resources to survive while rescue worked, which was true enough to say and kind enough to say without being naively optimistic about the parts that were not certain. Some of the men could feel the qualification he was leaving out. They did not push him on it. They understood, instinctively, the social contract of a crisis. The person managing the situation tells you what you need to know to function, and you trust that the thing they are not telling you is being carried by someone capable of carrying it. Deepak was sitting in his spot against the wall. He had his headlamp off. They had agreed to rotate the headlamps, not all on at the same time, and time limits on each, to preserve batteries. The darkness when his lamp was off was the most complete darkness he had ever experienced. Not the darkness of a room with curtains drawn, not the darkness of a night without a moon. This was the absence of light in a place that had never had any, and it pressed against his eyes so specifically it felt like a physical substance rather than an absence. He was thinking about Priya. He was thinking about the way she laughed, genuinely laughed, the kind that made her close her eyes when something caught her off guard. He was thinking about the argument they had 3 days ago, something small and stupid about money and priorities, and the way it had ended without being fully resolved because they were both tired and had chosen to leave it for later. He wanted there to be a later. He thought about Suresh telling him the wall talks. He thought about the sound of the mountain before the collapse, that long groaning breath, and the way his father-in-law had set his tool down with such care. Not thrown it. Not dropped it. Set it down, gently. Even in that moment, Suresh had had the presence to treat the earth with respect. Deepak thought, I will be like that. When I'm older. I will be the one who teaches the young men to listen. He had not yet allowed himself to think about the possibility that there would not be an older. He was keeping that thought outside a door he had closed and locked in some interior room of himself, and he was not going to open that door, and he was going to think about Priya's laugh and the argument they needed to finish and the fact that he was 26 and had, until this morning, an ordinary unremarkable life that he had not spent enough time being grateful for. He was very grateful for it now. On the surface, by the end of the first day, something was shifting in the crowd at the gate. The initial shock was wearing away and, in its place was a specific kind of anger, not hot and explosive, but cold and accumulating, the kind that happens when people who are frightened and desperate begin comparing notes with each other and find that their individual concerns are adding up to a collective understanding. Hakim had told his wife about the ventilation complaints. His wife had told the woman beside her at the gate. That woman's husband worked in the mines administration building and had seen Rajan receive a document in early March, a document delivered by a man in an engineer's jacket who had left in a hurry. Two of the other miners from the main shaft crew had noticed, over the preceding weeks, that the eastern tunnel was being worked harder than they had ever seen it worked, longer shifts, shorter equipment maintenance windows, the drilling schedule pushed to its edge. None of this was evidence. None of it was a story in the newspaper. It was the texture of a community's awareness of itself, the way people who live and work together develop a composite knowledge of their environment that is more accurate than any individual's account. And the composite knowledge at the gate of the Darwa mine, by the evening of the first day, was pointing in a direction that Rajan Mehta's carefully constructed morning press statement had not intended it to point. A local journalist named Neha Srivastava had been at the gate since early afternoon. She was 29, from the regional paper, and she had covered the mine beat for 3 years, which meant she had attended enough company press statements and filed enough articles that said carefully managed things about workplace safety initiatives that she had developed a very accurate sense for when a story was running alongside what she was being told rather than inside it. She was talking to the families. Quietly, one at a time, not with a recorder out but with the focused attention of someone building a map in their head. She talked to Suresh, who told her about the sounds in the wall. She talked to a woman whose husband had been complaining for weeks about the ventilation in the eastern sector. She talked to a man who had left the mine 2 months ago, a man named Chandru who had quit because he felt the safety margins were being compressed too fast and who had, before he left, heard another worker mention something about a survey that had been done, a man who had come and walked the eastern tunnel and come back looking like he had seen something he didn't want to have seen. Neha Srivastava wrote down Chandru's account in her notebook. She underlined one sentence. She looked up at the management building for a moment. Then, she put her notebook away and called her editor. Inside, Rajan Mehta was on his 4th call with legal counsel. The picture being constructed in those calls was methodical. The incident would be characterized as an unforeseen geological event. The company had been operating within its licensed parameters. The safety complaints in Hakim's logbook, which legal counsel had already requested a copy of from Anand, were being reframed as routine operational notes, the kind that appear in all mine logs and do not constitute evidence of specific known risk. The Sharma report was still in the drawer. It had not moved. The plan was coherent. The plan was, in its cold and calculated way, competent. It depended on a few things remaining stable, the rescue remaining in normal rescue rather than an investigation, the families remaining grieving rather than organized, the journalist at the gate remaining on the outside of the story rather than developing sources inside it, and the men in the sealed tunnel remaining in the sealed tunnel. That last dependency was both the most important and the most fragile. Because every hour those men remained alive was an hour in which the rescue teams were on site and asking questions. And every question Vikram Nair asked that was answered with 2014 documents was an hour that added to the expression in Vikram's eyes that Anand was now coming back to report on in terms that made Rajan's jaw tighten. He's thorough, Anand said carefully. He's asking about the ventilation infrastructure. He asked specifically whether there had been any recent assessments. Rajan said nothing for a moment. Then, tell him the documentation is being compiled. He's going to keep asking. Tell him the documentation is being compiled, Rajan said again, with the emphasis that meant the conversation was over. Anand left. Rajan turned to the window. Outside, the families were still at the gate. The light strung along the fence perimeter made the scene look different from the daytime, more desperate somehow, the faces more exposed, the emotions less managed. He watched them for a while. He was not, in this moment, a monster in the sense that he felt no human connection to the scene below him. He was something more precise and more terrible. He was a man who felt the human connection and had decided, clearly and without excessive turmoil, that it was outweighed by other considerations. He had done this calculation. He had been doing it for 5 years, in smaller increments, every time he filed a budget that prioritized output over maintenance, every time he approved a schedule that pushed the drilling faster than the surveys recommended, every time he received a document and opened a drawer. He had been building to this moment for 5 years without knowing he was building to it. And now he was in it, and the question was whether the structure he had built would hold. He believed it would hold. He had the legal counsel. He had the compliance officer. He had Prakash Lal, who had been visiting this mine for 4 years and whose envelope collection created a mutual investment in the outcome. He had managed the documentation. He had positioned the narrative. He had 19 men inside a mountain who, if they survived, and he assumed they would survive, the rescue teams were competent, the tunnel was apparently still standing, would emerge grateful to be alive and unlikely to immediately start organizing a legal case. He stood at the window and he believed the structure would hold. At the gate, Priya had been joined by her neighbor, a woman named Kamla, who had brought a shawl and food that Priya could not eat. They stood together without speaking much, the specific companionship of waiting that does not require conversation. Kamla held Priya's hand at intervals. Priya held her phone. The evening had turned cold in the way March evenings turn cold in the mountains, suddenly, completely, without much warning. Savitri had finally sat down on a low stone wall near the gate, still facing the mountain. Someone had brought her tea. It sat beside her, cooling. She had not touched it. She was thinking about the morning. She was thinking about the fact that she had left early today, had felt something pull her toward the mine gate before her usual time, and she was turning this over in her mind the way you turn over a stone at the bottom of a river, trying to see if there is something alive underneath it. She was thinking about whether she had known. Whether some part of her had felt the mountain's warning the way Suresh felt it with his hands. Whether the thing that made her leave early was the same kind of animal intelligence that made the birds go quiet before a storm. She did not know. She would never know. What she knew was that she was here, and that somewhere in the mountain in front of her, her son-in-law was alive and the night was getting colder and the tea was getting cold and nobody who had the power to make things move faster seemed to be moving fast enough. At 11:40 that night, Vikram Nair made his first breakthrough in the mapping of the collapse. His team had been drilling a narrow bore into the fallen section from the exit side, following the tunnel's trajectory, and the bore had broken through into an air pocket, not the main tunnel, but a cavity in the collapse that gave them acoustics, the ability to transmit and receive sound. He pressed a device against the breakthrough point. A listening device, essentially military grade, designed for exactly this purpose, thin enough to thread through the bore. Silence for 30 seconds. Then, a sound. Then, unmistakably, a voice. Distant and distorted by rock, but unmistakably human and unmistakably alive. The voice was saying something they couldn't quite make out. And then, it said something they could. It said, "We're here." Vikram pulled the device back and looked at it for a moment. Then, he looked at the tunnel wall. Then, at the team around him, who had all heard the same thing. 19 men, he said quietly, as if confirming to himself that the number he had been working toward was real. He told his team to prepare for sustained extraction operations. He told them they were going to need significantly more resources than currently committed, which meant he needed to talk to the state-level emergency coordinator, which meant the operation was going to scale up in a way that would bring more officials, more press, and more oversight. He made a note in his own record, the one he kept separate from the official documentation because 22 years had taught him that official documentation was not always the same as truth. In the note he wrote, "Ventilation inadequate, documentation gap appears significant, investigation warranted." He underlined the last 2 words. And he was right to underline them. Because the next 72 hours were going to change the shape of everything. The men inside were alive. They had made contact. Rescue was now formally confirmed as extraction rather than recovery. The families at the gate would hear this within the hour. The journalist at the gate would hear it shortly after. The state emergency coordinator would arrive in the morning with staff who asked different questions than Anand was equipped to deflect. And, somewhere in all of this, in the expansion of activity and oversight that contact with the 19 men would bring, there was a pressure building against the drawer in the table in the management building, a pressure that had been building since Sharma walked the eastern tunnel in late February and came back looking pale. The drawer had held so far. It had held because the structure around it had held the managed narrative, the compliant official, the careful documentation gap, the face at the window performing composure. But structure is only as strong as its weakest point. And the weakest point was not Vikram's investigation, though that was coming. It was not Neha Srivastava's notebook, though that was filling up. It was not even the voices of the families at the gate, though those voices were growing. The weakest point was something much simpler. It was human. It was the thing that lives in every person who has done something wrong and knows it and carries the knowing in their body like a stone in a pocket. The weakest point was someone who had been in that meeting on the morning of March 14th and who had spent the day watching families press themselves against a chain-link fence and who was starting to feel the weight of what they were carrying in a way that the initial calculation had not fully accounted for. Not Rajan. Not Vijay. The weakest point was sitting in a car in the mine's parking lot at midnight, watching the families through the windshield, with a phone in one hand and a decision in the other, and the decision was the kind that, once made, could not be unmade. The decision was whether to call a number that was not legal counsel. Outside, the night was very cold and very quiet except for the murmur of the families at the gate, and, in the sealed section of the eastern tunnel, 19 men were sleeping in shifts with their headlamps off to save power, and Deepak was lying against the wall with his eyes open in the absolute dark, thinking about later, and the rescue team was preparing for the long work of bringing the men out, and the drawer in the management building was closed. For now. For now it was closed. But something was shifting, the way things shift before they break, slowly at first, barely perceptible, and then, all at once. The smirk at the window had not accounted for this. It had accounted for the families and the journalist and the rescue team and the legal counsel. It had built its structure carefully and looked out from its window at the crowd below with the quiet confidence of a man who believes the things he has controlled will stay controlled. It had not accounted for midnight. It had not accounted for the weight of a stone in a pocket growing heavier in the dark. It had not accounted for the moment when a person sitting in a car in a parking lot looks through a windshield at a woman standing at a fence with her hand pressed against the chain link and makes a decision that the structure was not built to survive. The phone was in the hand. The number was on the screen. The weight was unbearable. And, outside, against the fence, Savitri's hand was flat against the metal, palm open, in the same position it had been in for 16 hours, as if she were still pressing it against something that talked, listening for what it was trying to say. The call was made at 12:24 in the morning. It lasted 11 minutes. The person who made it was Prakash Lal. He had sat in his car for 2 hours after the families at the gate refused to go home after the wives and mothers and children had been told by the company's spokesperson that they should return in the morning for updates, and the families had looked at the spokesperson and then looked at the mountain and then turned back to the fence and stayed. He had watched them through his windshield with his engine off and the heater fading and the cold coming through the glass, and he had sat with the stone in his pocket, the stone that was the meeting on the morning of March 14th, and the tea he had drunk while a report sat on a table and was placed in a drawer, and he had said nothing, and the weight of it had been building in his body all day in the way weight builds when it has nowhere to go. He was not a brave man. His career had been constructed on the precise architecture of not being brave, the careful art of looking where he was directed to look and writing what would cause the least disruption and accepting the envelope at the end of the visit and driving home to a life that the envelope helped furnish. He understood this about himself. He had made a kind of peace with it years ago, the way people make peace with the shape of themselves when they decide that the shape is fixed. But the woman at the fence. He could see her from the car. She had been there all day. She was still there, at midnight, in the cold, with her hand on the chain-link fence and her face toward the mountain and her body in the specific stillness of a person who has decided that standing is the only action left to them. He did not know her name. He did not know whose wife or mother or something she was. He knew only that she had been standing in that place for at least 10 of the 12 hours he had been at this mine, and that the persistence of her standing was doing something to the stone in his pocket that the 12 hours of careful management had been unable to do. It was making it heavier. At 12:24, he dialed the number of the state's Central Mine Inspection Authority. Not the local office, the state headquarters, in the capital, the office that oversaw all mine inspections and their records and had the authority to compel documentation that local compliance officers could deflect and regional inspectors could lose in a drawer. The person who answered was a duty officer, awake because these things always had someone awake, and Prakash identified himself and said he needed to report a documentation concern related to the ongoing incident at the Darwa colliery. The duty officer put him through to a senior inspector. Prakash told the senior inspector about the meeting on the morning of March 14th. He told him about Sharma's report. He told him about the drawer. He told him what the three of them had decided while 31 men were underground, in tunnels the report had described as structurally unsuitable for continued active extraction. The senior inspector asked him to say it again, more slowly. Prakash said it again. The senior inspector said, "Is this report still in the drawer?" Prakash said he believed so. The senior inspector said, "Don't speak to anyone at the mine until we arrive." He said it without raising his voice, with the calm specificity of someone who has been trained for exactly this scenario and whose training has told him that the most important thing in the first 30 seconds of receiving this kind of information is to prevent the person on the other end of the line from doing anything that gives the other party time to act first. "We'll be there in the morning," the senior inspector said. "There are 19 men still underground," Prakash said. His voice was doing something it had not done during the entire managed, careful, envelope-receiving arc of his career. It was doing something unsteady. "I know," the senior inspector said. "The rescue operation continues. This is separate. Don't speak to anyone at the mine." The call ended. Prakash sat in his car in the parking lot with the phone in his lap. Outside, the woman at the fence had not moved. He sat there for a while longer. He did not feel better in the way he had half hoped he might feel better, the way people imagine they will feel better after a confession. He felt the stone still in his pocket, lighter by perhaps a fraction, and, in the space that fraction had opened up he felt something else, something colder and more specific, which was the understanding that the thing he had just done could not be undone and that his own accounting was now coming as surely as anyone else's. He started the car. He drove to the rest house the company had arranged for overnight visitors, 3 kilometers from the mine. He lay down on the bed without taking off his shoes and he looked at the ceiling and he did not sleep. At 7:15 the next morning, a convoy of 3 government vehicles arrived at the Darwa mine with 4 inspectors from the state's Central Mine Inspection Authority and 2 officers from the state police's Economic Offenses Wing. They did not announce themselves to the company's management. They drove through the main gate, which the security guard opened because they presented credentials he was not authorized to refuse, and they went directly to the management building. The senior inspector led the team. He was 57 years old, in government service for 31 years, and he had the manner of a man who has been given a clear task and intends to complete it without dramatic embellishment. He knocked on the office door once. Rajan was inside. He had arrived early, which he always did during a crisis. The appearance of diligence was part of the management of the situation. He was on the phone when the knock came, and he said hold on to the person on the phone and said come in, and the senior inspector came in with 2 of his colleagues and the expression on the inspector's face was not angry, precisely, but it was absolute, the expression of someone who was not here to negotiate or to listen to a statement or to drink tea. "We have a report from an official present at a meeting in this room on the morning of March 14th, the senior inspector said, indicating that a structural assessment of the eastern tunnel sectors was received and reviewed by management prior to the commencement of the morning shift, and that said assessment was not disclosed to rescue authorities or regulatory bodies following the collapse." "I need that document." Rajan's hand was still holding the phone. The person on the other end was legal counsel. He had been talking about the exact scenario he was now inside. He said nothing for 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, the calculation that he had been running for 18 months, the output target, the drawer, the envelope, the managed narrative ran its final iteration and arrived at its final result. He put the phone down without ending the call. He stood up. He crossed the room. He opened the drawer. He placed Sharma's report on the table. The senior inspector picked it up. He did not look at it for long. He already knew what it said. Prakash had described its contents in enough detail over the 11-minute call that the morning's actions had been carefully prepared. But he looked at it long enough to confirm the date in the top right corner, March 6, 2024. 8 days before the collapse. 8 days in which 31 men had continued working in sectors that a qualified engineer had described as unsuitable for continued active extraction. He put the report into an evidence bag. He looked at Rajan. "Please sit down," he said. It was not a request in the way a polite suggestion is a request. Rajan sat down. The next 4 hours were the beginning of the end of the structure. Vijay Sood was contacted at the regional compliance office and asked to present himself. He presented himself at noon, with his own legal counsel, but legal counsel could not make Sharma's report disappear from the evidence bag and could not explain away the 11 days of unanswered ventilation complaints in Hakim's logbook and could not account for the 2014 documents that had been presented to Vikram Nair instead of the current survey. Vikram Nair, when the inspectors came to him with copies of the documents and, with Sharma's full assessment, stood very still for a moment in the particular way of a man who has been doing a job for 22 years and thought he had seen all the ways it could go wrong, and who has just seen a new way. "I asked for this document," he said. "Specifically, I asked for any recent structural assessments. I was told there were none." He looked at the date on Sharma's report for a long time. "I could have reconfigured the extraction approach," he said, more quietly. "I could have drilled a different angle. I could have." He stopped himself. He looked at the inspector. "How long have the men been in there?" 41 hours. Vikram turned back to the collapse face. He picked up his radio. "All teams," he said. "We're changing the extraction approach. Briefing in 10 minutes. Outside, at the gate, the families had been there all night. Not all of them, some had gone home for a few hours, for children to be fed and, briefly held and, returned to the care of relatives, before coming back. But, there had been people at that gate continuously for 41 hours. The night had passed in a collective vigil. People had brought food and blankets and a generator for the lights that the company should have provided but had not. Someone had organized a rotation system for the families who needed to sleep, a communal pile of blankets near the stone wall, and people took turns lying down and then getting up and returning to the fence because the fence was where the connection was, the physical proximity to the mountain, the last available gesture in the direction of the men inside. Savitri had slept for 2 hours on the blankets at some point before dawn, lying on her side with her eyes closed and her mind running a loop that was not quite sleep and not quite waking. She had dreamed about the mountain. In the dream, the mountain was breathing slowly, steadily, a vast and patient respiration, and she was pressing her hand against its surface the way Suresh pressed his hand against the tunnel wall, and she could feel the breathing under her palm like a heartbeat, and it was regular and slow and alive. She had woken from this dream with a very specific feeling of certainty that she could not have explained to anyone and did not try to explain. She simply sat up, folded the blanket, walked back to the fence, and resumed standing. At 3:17 in the afternoon of the second day, the extraction bore reached the main cavity behind the collapse. The bore was wider than the first contact bore, wide enough, barely, to thread a camera through. Vikram's team fed the camera through the breakthrough point and watched the monitor as it emerged from the rock into the air beyond. The image was dark and gray and dusty. The camera swept slowly. Then, a light. A headlamp. Then, a face. The face belonged to Balram, who had been sitting near the collapse point for the last several hours, close enough to monitor developments in the rock face, the way a man monitors a door he believes is about to open. He had heard the drilling long before it broke through. He had told the others. He had told them to conserve their energy and their voice for when it mattered, because rescue teams used listening devices and sound carried through stone, and, when the moment came, they needed to be heard. When the bore broke through and the camera emerged, Bolram was ready. He pressed his face close to the bore opening and he said, clearly and loudly, something that the camera audio picked up with a crackle and a rush of stale air. He said, 19 men. All alive. Some need medical attention. On the monitor in the rescue command post, Vikram watched the face say these words. He sat there for a moment, and the people around him were very quiet in the way people are quiet when the thing they have been working toward arrives and is real, and the realness of it requires a moment before anything else. Then, Vikram said, "Tell him we're coming." The extraction took 31 hours. It was not fast. It could not be fast. The conditions of the collapse and the configuration of the remaining tunnel required a painstaking approach, widening the bore carefully, shoring as they went, managing the risk of secondary collapse that was real and present. The ventilation had to be restored as a priority before the bore was large enough to bring anyone through, because the air quality on the other side had degraded to a level that required immediate intervention. This was the piece that the delay in providing Sharma's report had cost them 24 hours of extraction that could have begun on a better trajectory if Vikram had been working with correct information from the start. The cost of those 24 hours was not death. This time, the 19 men had survived. They were weakened, some were sick from the poor air, one had developed a respiratory condition that would take months to resolve, and all of them had aged in a way that was not measurable on a clock but visible in their faces when they finally came through the bore opening and stood in the light. Deepak came through on the morning of the third day. He was the 7th man extracted. He came through the opening on his hands and knees, because the bore had been widened to allow passage but not to allow dignity, and he emerged into the tunnel on the exit side covered in dust and blinking in the headlamps of the rescue team, and the first thing he did was stand up, which took him a moment because his legs had decided this would be a challenge, and the second thing he did was turn to the rescue worker who took his arm and say, "My father-in-law. Suresh. He made it out? The first day?" The rescue worker said yes. Deepak closed his eyes for a moment. Then, he opened them and walked toward the main shaft on legs that trembled but held. At the surface, in a system that Vikram's team had set up to manage the arrivals, families notified, medical team ready, press held back past a respectful distance, Priya was waiting in the designated family area when the 7th extraction was announced. She did not run. She walked, very fast, the specific walk of a person who has been still for too long and whose body is now compensating, and she came through the barrier and she saw him and he saw her, and neither of them said anything for a while because there was nothing in language that was as accurate as the act of one person pressing themselves against another person and just breathing. She cried. He held her and she cried, and he did not cry, not yet. He would cry later, alone, in the shower of their house, when the water was running and the door was closed and it was just him and the wall and the months of having been 26 years old and lying in absolute underground darkness thinking about this exact moment. Savitri was waiting outside the family area. Priya brought Deepak to her as soon as she could, and Savitri took his face in her hands, both hands, the way she had held him at his wedding, and looked at it for a very long time without speaking. Then, she pulled him down to her height and held his head against her shoulder and stood there. Suresh was there too. He and Deepak embraced with the particular strength of two men who both understand, because they were both in that tunnel at 8:03 when the mountain made its second sound, exactly what it means to be standing at the surface on the third day looking at each other. "You listened," Suresh said. Deepak said, "You taught me." The last man was extracted at 11:40 on the morning of the third day. When he came through, Vikram's team stood outside the bore opening and watched him emerge, and there was a specific collective release in that moment, not celebration, not yet, but the physical unwinding of a tension that had been held for 72 hours in the bodies of the people who had been working without stopping toward this. All 19 men were alive. In the management building, Rajan Mehta had not been free to go. The two officers from the Economic Offences Wing had been there since morning, working through the building's documentation with the systematic unhurriedness of people who have a warrant and no deadline. The computers. The file cabinets. The email records. The phone logs. The financial accounts that connected to Prakash Lal's visits and the envelopes and 4 years of regulated theater. The drawer was already empty. Its contents were in an evidence bag in the state capitol. But the drawer was only one part of the picture, and the picture, as it assembled itself over the following days from the documentary evidence and the testimony of Prakash Lal and the independent confirmation of Sharma, who had been located at his home in the city and who agreed to speak to the inspectors immediately because he had been carrying the weight of his own knowledge since March and had not known what to do with it but had kept a copy of the report, was a picture that covered years and decisions and the particular slow violence of choosing not to fix things because fixing things cost money that was going instead somewhere else. Rajan Mehta was arrested on the 4th day. Vijay Sood was arrested the same afternoon. Prakash Lal was arrested and released on bail within the week, his cooperation noted in the record, his accounting not finished but differently shaped now. He had made the call, and the call mattered, and the law would have to decide what proportion of that mattered relative to the years of envelopes, and that reckoning would take time. The arrests were not the end. They were a beginning of a kind, the beginning of a legal process that would move with the speed that legal processes move in, which is to say slowly, and with the weight that legal accountability carries when it finally arrives, which is to say heavily. There would be hearings. There would be lawyers. There would be the long, detailed, carefully documented reconstruction of what was known and when and by whom and what was decided in its presence. The families at the gate had known something was wrong before any of this became official. They had felt it in the texture of the management's responses, in the time it took to provide basic information, in the managed composure of the faces at the window. The official confirmation arrived in pieces, through the news, through the courts, through the growing coverage that Neha Srivastava had been building since she first sat outside the gate with her notebook and started talking to people. Her article ran on the 5th day, a long, carefully sourced account of the sequence of events from Sharma's site visit in late February to the drawer to the 11 days of ignored ventilation complaints to the morning meeting to the collapse. She had 3 independent sources for the meeting. She had a copy of the ventilation complaint log from Hakim, who had handed it to her directly, in a sealed envelope, with a note that said, "I have been keeping this record for years for exactly this reason. Please do not waste it." She did not waste it. The article was read across the country. It was shared, discussed, cited in Parliament, cited in subsequent regulatory reviews of mine inspection practices and compliance processes. It was not just a story about the Darwa mine, it was a story about the architecture of managed risk, about the precise and detailed process by which institutions that are supposed to protect people instead protect the conditions that put people in danger, and about the particular human capacity to put a report in a drawer and look out a window and believe the structure will hold. The structure, in the end, had not held. It had not held because of a woman standing at a fence for 16 hours. It had not held because of a man who drove to a parking lot at midnight and sat in the cold with a stone in his pocket and found it, eventually, too heavy to carry alone. It had not held because Hakim had kept a logbook for 11 years with the quiet faith that paper outlasts power, and he had been right. It had not held because Suresh Babu had spent 30 years pressing his hands against walls and teaching people to listen. Months later, after the extraction and the arrests and the hearings and the news cycle had moved on to other things, Deepak went back to the mine. Not to work. The mine had been shut down pending the investigation and subsequent regulatory review. The eastern tunnel had been sealed. The gate that had been covered with families for 3 days was chained and padlocked, and the mountain above it was quiet in the way mountains are quiet when the thing they were being asked to do beyond their capacity has finally stopped being asked of them. He went alone. He stood outside the fence and looked at the ventilation shaft where the dust had risen on the morning of March 14. He looked at the management building, empty now, its windows dark. He looked at the mountain. He was standing there, thinking nothing precisely, just standing, when he felt an impulse that he would have called strange if it had come from anyone other than his own hands. He reached out. He pressed his palm flat against the metal of the fence. He held it there. He did not know what he was listening for, exactly. He was not Suresh. He had not spent 30 years learning to read what the earth said. But he stayed there with his hand on the fence for a long time, and the mountain was quiet, and the morning air moved through the valley the way it had always moved, indifferent and clean, and he thought about Bolram pressing his face to the bore opening and saying 19 men, all alive, and he thought about the absolute dark in the tunnel and the door in himself he had kept locked for 72 hours and then opened alone in the shower, and he thought about Priya making tea in their kitchen that morning with the window that looked out over the neighbor's garden. He thought about later. The later that existed. The later he had thought about in the dark as a thing to fight for, which was now the ordinary unremarkable present that he had not spent enough time being grateful for and intended to spend the rest of his life spending time on. He took his hand off the fence. He turned around and walked toward the road. The mountain was behind him and the morning was ahead of him and the valley was as it had always been, too old to be surprised by what people do to each other in it, but also too old to believe it is ever the final word. Rajan Mehta's trial began 14 months after the collapse. He arrived at the courthouse in the gray suit he had worn for press statements and his face was arranged in the composed and collected manner that had served him for years in rooms where he needed to project control. He sat in the defendant's seat and he listened to the charges: criminal negligence, suppression of evidence, endangerment of workers, criminal breach of trust, and his face did not change in any visible way. But the room was full. The gallery was full. Suresh was there, in the third row, with his wide flat hands resting on his knees. Deepak was beside him. Priya was there. Hakim was there, with the logbook in his lap, not as evidence that had already been submitted, but because he had brought it the way a person brings the thing that cost them the most to produce, to be present at the accounting. Savitri was there, in the second row, in the same blue sari she had been wearing the morning she carried the tiffin container up the road to the mine gate and saw the dust on the faces of the men standing outside the shaft. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight and her eyes forward. Vikram Nair was there. Neha Srivastava was there, in the press section, with her notebook open and her pen ready and the expression of a person who has been waiting for this room for 14 months and intends to record it completely. The judge began to speak. And, in the room, as the formal language of the law began its slow and necessary accounting, the sound that settled over everything was a silence of a very specific kind, not the absence of sound, because there was sound, the judge's voice, the rustling of papers, the breathing of a full gallery, but the silence that exists inside the hearing of something that has taken too long to be said. The silence of people who have been waiting for the weight to be redistributed and who are watching, carefully, with the tired and committed attention of the people who paid for the waiting with their nights at the fence and their hours in the dark and their years of pressing palms against walls, watching the process of the world arriving, slowly and imperfectly but arriving, at the place where the drawer gets opened and the report gets read and the reckoning begins. The smirk had been at the window on the morning of March 14th, smoothing its collar, walking toward the gate with its managed face and its clean suit and its careful story. And the silence that had followed, the silence of the collapse, the silence of the darkness, the silence of 19 men in a sealed tunnel, the silence of a parking lot at midnight, the silence of a woman's hand on a fence, was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of everything accumulating. It was the silence that precedes the moment when the structure, finally, gives. And, in the courtroom, in the second row, Savitri unfolded her hands and placed one of them flat on the wooden bench beside her, palm down, the way a person places a hand on something solid to feel that it is real. She held it there. She was listening.